You're listening to the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio. And hey, remember how I used to tell you that producer Lucas had two posters in his bedroom growing up on the wall? One was of Beethoven, and the other one was of Gwen Stefani. And that's certainly true, but he also had a very, very small, just on his bedside table, a very small portrait of Antonio Vivaldi. And you guys all know Vivaldi, right? If you're a classical music fan, you know about the Four Seasons. Yeah. Is this spring, Lucas?
This is spring.
Yeah, and we're coming up to spring, and keep it playing, Lucas. Keep it going. Keep it going. It's beautiful. And sometimes you hear this music in elevators. Sometimes you hear it on the radio, concert halls. I was invited I got free tickets to go to a symphony concert with the Four Seasons, and it was awesome. I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. But did you know that Antonio Vivaldi was kind of a Baroque version of Jimi Hendrix? Can you believe this? Well, Vivaldi, and by the way, he was also a Catholic priest. A lot of people don't know that. And yeah, I would gander that even producer Lucas didn't know that growing up, because Lucas is a convert to Catholicism, so he found that out later, but he did always, of course, admire Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Now, Elise Harris, not too long ago, wrote a piece for the Catholic News Agency about Vivaldi's background. And everybody knows about the Four Seasons, but his sacred music is way less well known. He actually wrote a piece of sacred music for the Mass when he was 13 years old. So he was kind of like a little bit like Mozart, a little precocious in that sense. And here's what there's a researcher on Vivaldi who's really like dedicated her life to promoting his works. She's a British researcher named Mickey White, and maybe her real name is Michaela. I don't know. Sometimes we call our daughter Michaela Mickey. But here's what she says. Mickey White says, "I'm going to give you the most bizarre idea. Think of the Pope, who represents, of course, the priesthood, spiritual things. And then you've got, on the other hand, Jimi Hendrix, a superb guitarist, one of the greatest of all time. You put them together, and you've got Vivaldi." How about that? So Vivaldi was the Hendrix of his day. He combined the spirituality of a pope with the virtuosity of Jimi Hendrix. It seems bizarre. It seems strange. But she says, in his day, when the Four Seasons came out, and I think it was 1721 it came out, early 18th century, it was considered really, really out there, almost like Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix. Hit it, Lucas. Yeah. So you've probably all seen Hendrix, Woodstock and all that sort of stuff, through the haze of other kinds of smoke. And yeah, that was before my time, the hippie generation. But excuse me while I kiss the sky. Okay, we've all heard that. So that was kind of when people first heard the Four Seasons. That's kind of that was their reaction. They were tripping out. Folks. But it was written by a priest. Anyways, Bach wasn't a priest. Mozart wasn't a priest. Lucas's hero Beethoven wasn't a priest, but Vivaldi was a priest. And apparently this comes across in his music. So, anyways, it's just kind of wild stuff. He was also known as, by the way, Vivaldi was known as the Red Priest. Just a little factoid for you, because he had auburn hair. So he was born in 1678 on March the 4th, on this day in 1678, which would make him 344 years old if he were still alive today. And apparently his father was a very instrumental figure in his life, pun intended there. He was also a professional violinist. He taught his son how to play, which is kind of the electric guitar of the time, I guess you could say. And they actually went on tour together throughout Venice, and he was a huge influence in his life. But when he was 15 years old, Vivaldi started studying for the priesthood when he was only 15. And he was ordained in 1703 at the age of 25. Now, afterwards, he was actually appointed the chaplain and violin master at a local orphanage called the Devout Hospital of Mercy. And that was a home for abandoned babies, and young children were raised by older girls who were already there. the boys were taught a specific trade, and they were actually kind of kicked out and told to get jobs when they're 15 years old. But the girls stayed, and they were trained as musicians if they had the ability. And the very most talented of all the girls in the orphanage would stay on and become members of the choir and orchestra of the hospital. And so Vivaldi was kind of there off and on until the year 1740, and he composed some of his most famous works in that time. After just a year, though, after just a year being ordained, which he'd be about 26 years old, he actually got a dispensation from celebrating Mass because he was actually in really bad health. He had an unknown respiratory condition, which might have been a form of asthma that just they didn't really know what it was at the time. But he referred to it as a tightness of the chest, and he actually gave up saying Mass because of it. And so that was a big loss for him. But obviously, once a priest, always a priest. And that was a huge part of his life, and it comes out in his music. And anyway, so unfortunately, he died pretty much penniless because for various reasons he didn't have any kind of connections. In those days, you kind of had to have a patron to keep you going financially. But really, he was kind of he was really kind of the Justin Bieber of his time, the Jimi Hendrix of his time. He would have been able to do like modern rock concerts, arena rock of his day. And it's hard to think of the Four Seasons like that. But that's pretty much what it was all about. So I found that kind of fascinating. And in fact, there's even kind of a contrary view. There's a very famous violinist, one of the biggest in the world. His name is Nigel Kennedy. And he actually had some really harsh words, which I can't even quote you because they're full of expletives, but he actually says that Jimi Hendrix is greater than Vivaldi. He says actually Hendrix should be talked about like the great composers. The great composers. He says Vivaldi is lighter stuff. He doesn't say stuff, but he said Vivaldi is lighter stuff that people can listen to while they're drinking their coffee. So anyways, this guy, Nigel Kennedy, he recorded the Four Seasons on his violin in 1989. It was actually one of the best-selling classical albums of all time. But he thinks Hendrix is in he's in another league, and he thinks Hendrix is unbelievable, really groundbreaking as a musician. So how about that? So kind of got me thinking. With Vivaldi being a priest, you can kind of feel the sacred in his music. Can we find God through music? I think it's pretty obvious that the question is yes. Yes. And there's but some people are still looking, even if they're deep into it. And one such person is a guy named Brad Mehldau. Brad Mehldau. He's actually a Grammy-winning jazz pianist. And he won a Grammy in the year 2020. And he wrote a little article on his website called Coltrane, Jimi Hendrix, Beethoven, and God. Vivaldi wasn't there for some reason, but Coltrane, Jimi Hendrix, Beethoven, and God. And it's really kind of interesting. He talked about how when he was a kid, Brad Mehldau, he went to kind of a music camp every summer. I don't know if you have an experience of going to summer camp growing up, but he went to a camp called Marywood for 3 summers in a row when he was 10, 11, and 12 years old. And it was actually located in Massachusetts in a place called the Berkshire Mountains. And it was actually less than a mile away from a place called Tanglewood. And Tanglewood is a very famous outdoor concert venue, and that's where the Boston Symphony Orchestra plays every summer. So basically for these kids, Marywood was essentially just music camp. And they would play chamber music, there was private lessons, they would sing in a choir, and there was also other things they could do during the day, like go swimming and hiking and play sports and stuff like that. But Brad Mehldau, Grammy-winning artist, he says his most precious memories from this time were going to Tanglewood, this outdoor concert venue, and he heard Leonard Bernstein conduct. He heard Yo-Yo Ma, back when Yo-Yo Ma was just a young guy, and he said it was just amazing. But then, during his 3rd summer, which I guess when he was 12 years old, Brad Mehldau had a friend who was staying in the same cabin as him. He was a year older than him, and his name was Lewis. He said, "Brad, you got to check this out. What's this? This is John Coltrane. I don't know if you've heard of the John Coltrane Quartet, but he's an incredible jazz musician, one of my favorites. Actually, Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, when he was on the show, he talked about his love of jazz. He's really, really into jazz. It was such a fun conversation. So he's probably pretty fond of Coltrane, and Coltrane had kind of a deep spirituality as well. One of his albums is called A Love Supreme, and it's really all about God. And believe it or not, I think it's San Francisco. Some people have even started a Church of John Coltrane, which is clearly misguided, but it's kind of based on the spirituality of his music. Anyways, this kid named Lewis told Brad Meldau about the John Coltrane Quartet, and he said, you got to check this out. And it was actually a recording of John Coltrane Quartet playing My Favorite Things. And we got a clip for you. Check it out. Yeah, it's great stuff. These are a few of my favorite things. So this was a live recording. It played for more than 20 minutes. And Brad Meldau was just floored by this. He was just floored. He was like, wow. And so this kid from New York City, his friend Lewis, was really, really into jazz. And he had never really kind of heard this before. He's like, man, all the kids back in my hometown, they're listening to the Police, they're listening to Van Halen. These kids from New York City are listening to John Coltrane. And he was like, whoa, it was almost a spiritual experience for him, because in this cabin at the summer camp, there's no air conditioning. It was kind of like being in a sweat lodge. And he was like, man, we were in this thing. We closed all the blinds, shut the windows, and we listened to Coltrane for nearly half an hour on this guy's cassette player. And he said, I was sweating. I was freaking out. It was awesome. I had never heard any music remotely like that. When we emerged again from the cabin, I was changed. Sometimes music can do that to you. It raised the bar for my expectation as to what music could and should be. The intensity of Coltrane was something I chased thereafter as a listener. And later on, when I myself became a jazz musician, it was my ideal when I played. Then he had another kid in his cabin who was listening to Jimi Hendrix. And so he'd never really experienced Hendrix before either. So this guy plays him a cassette tape of one of Hendrix's guitar solos, and he said, it just took me somewhere else and dumped me there. I was lost after that guitar solo. It seemed to carry the grief of the world on it. It was so deep and beautiful. I was just lost to it. So he said, man, thinking about Coltrane and Hendrix, I got scared by their music, and I was trembling, and then I was able to pinpoint that fear. I was afraid because this was the confrontation with the sublime that the philosophers talk about. You confront something that is greater than you and greater that was, up until that point, safely contained in your worldview. It's unfamiliar, and your initial reaction is fear. Fear of the unknown and fear of something bigger and more powerful than you, something that can crush you. That sounds dramatic, but can music do that to you? Can music actually introduce you to something much, much bigger than you, God himself? We're going to answer that question after this little break on the Cale Clarke Show, and we'll be right back. 888-914-9149.
This is the Cale Clarke Show, giving you the confidence you need to bring the faith into everyday life.
Hey, welcome back to the program. 888-914-9149 is the number to call if you want to react to anything that you've heard up to this point. It's Vivaldi's birthday. Antonio Vivaldi would have been 344 years old today. The composer of the Four Seasons. He was actually considered to be the Jimi Hendrix of his day. This music was kind of out there at the time. It was kind of wild. But he was also a Catholic priest. That a lot of people don't know that. So a lot of spirituality to the music. And talking about finding God through music, or at least the attempt to. And just before the break, I was sharing with you a writing from the Grammy award-winning jazz musician Brad Meldau. And he was talking about how he discovered Coltrane in a summer camp. He discovered Jimi Hendrix that same summer. And it just kind of blew him away and actually kind of gave him an encounter with something much, much bigger than himself. So I just want to continue on with what he was saying, because unfortunately he hasn't come onto the right path through this. But check this out. He says, quote, "The Coltrane and Hendrix that summer registered as pleasure for me, of course, but they were a new kind of pleasure. It was destabilizing. I felt like there was something dangerous about their music. I literally got scared by their music the first time, and I was trembling. Later on, I was able to pinpoint that fear. This was the confrontation with the sublime, like the philosophers talked about, something greater than you, what to this point was kind of like in a box, safely contained in your worldview, and now it's kind of out of the box. So fear of the unknown, fear of something bigger, more powerful than you, something that could crush you." And he says, this sounds dramatic. Can mere music do that to you? For me, the answer is yes. Music like Coltrane's inspires fear and wonder in me in the same way that a huge wave swelling in the ocean does, or a huge mountain expanse. It is evidence of something greater than us. That suggests a religious feeling. When the writers of the Bible wrote about fear of God, I think they were trying to sketch out the nature of this confrontation with the sublime. But then he kind of goes off track here. He says the big three Western religions lost their way. And I think he's talking about, obviously, Christianity, Judaism. He's also talking about Islam, I think, even though, truthfully speaking, neither of those are Western religions, really, because Christianity and Judaism actually come from the East, and so does Islam. But anyways, he says the big three Western religions lost their way and faltered, turning away from this kind of truly religious experience. The sublime is actually harrowing. So instead of fearing what is truly infinite and unknowable, people created something that they could fear in a more normative, regulated environment. They began to worship and fear a more human-like phantom, a patriarchal god, in the three Western monotheistic religions. He is variously a jealous, vengeful, conquest-seeking, and crusading god. More recently, he is a violent megalomaniac god who tells people to blow themselves up in his name. All right, so let me just stop there for a second. So he's obviously got a lot of misconceptions about who God is. And so this idea of, he calls God a human-like phantom. Well, no, this is not the God of Jesus Christ. In fact, God the Son, Jesus of Nazareth, the second person in the Holy Trinity, came to earth not as a phantom, as the God-man, 100% God, 100% human. So this is not a phantasm, not a phantom. And so I've spoken at length elsewhere about the idea of, on the Faith Explained program, I recently did a whole show on the violence in the Old Testament. Is God a God of violence? Is he conquest-seeking? You know what I'm talking about. Just like this guy Brad Meldau says. Is this what he's all about? No, he's not. But he goes on to say something else, though. He says, and we'll get to your calls in just a minute, 1-888-914-9149. He says, quote, "The sublime manifested in Coltrane seemed to come from far away, from somewhere I didn't know about. Those shepherds who were hanging out a few thousand years ago were picking up on something not immediately tractable. It's something from another time and another place that's not our own. Yet we are able to view it momentarily now and then if we are paying attention. Western religion was correct in one sense. A certain amount of fear is healthy because it teaches humility." I would agree with him on this. And I think when the Bible talks about fear of God, it's talking more about awe and reverence, not like a servile fear, a fear of being hit by a lightning bolt. Let me just get back to this guy. So back to what Brad Meldau, Grammy-winning jazz artist, wrote. He said, "Before it got all mangled and the fear turned sour and wrathful, that was a pretty hip realization. Listening to great music for me is always humbling, and trying to play music is a constant exercise in humility. The ego overextends itself and must be reined in and corrected repeatedly. We should never lose the ability to be awed. And then he basically says that he's a Gnostic. Now, what is Gnosticism? This was Gnosticism is a heresy that started in the early church, and eventually, these people separated from the church. But they had a false teaching. They basically said that God never became human; He only appeared to be human. So the incarnation, it isn't real. They actually do think Jesus is a phantasm of sorts. And also, the word Gnosticism, it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So these little groups, they basically said, you have to join our group, and then we'll give you the key of knowledge. Once you become an insider in our group, we'll tell you the truth about God that the Catholic Church doesn't want you to know. So we even to this day, there are a lot of groups like that. It's a very persistent heresy that the incarnation isn't real, and that the Catholic Church is trying to hide something from you. Well, no, because God's revelation is public. The Catholic Church, Catholic, universal, it's for all people, all times, all places. This was not done in a corner, as St. Peter says in the Acts of the Apostles, the life, death, burial, resurrection, ascension of Jesus, the message about that, it's very much in public, it's very much for everybody, and so that's why we're doing what we're doing here at Relevant Radio, to get the word out. So anyways, he says that this guy, Brad Meldau, says that he is a Gnostic. And he says, because I'm a musician, he says, I believe God is what we confront in the sublime. And because I'm a musician, I encounter it most often in music. A great athlete will encounter it at his or her best moments. And I think that's true. Like we can, and we had a recent program about this, how people, can encounter God through various mediums. We can encounter God through all things. We talked about how we can reach, God can speak to us through nature, through Scripture, through the sacraments, through other people, through the liturgy, through all kinds of different things in our human experience. But some people connect with God they sort of have a favorite way to connect with God. And for some people, it's through music. The beauty of music. There's a lot of, by the way, near-death experiences where people say when they've come back, they keep talking about this music that they can't even describe that they heard while they were, quote-unquote, on the other side. We'll have to do a show about NDEs, near-death experiences, really soon. I know some people who are experts in that, so just a little tease for you there. But this guy says, hey, athletes can encounter the divine at their best moments. I'm reminded of Eric Liddell in the movie Chariots of Fire, which is a real-life story about the British Olympian Eric Liddell, who wanted to become a missionary to China, which he eventually did, and he eventually lost his life doing missionary work in China. But he said, God made me for China, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. So and there's a great scene in the movie where he's winning his race in the Olympics, and that's, you could just see like the spirituality of what he's doing in the moment, the running. It's an incredible film. If you haven't seen Chariots of Fire, you might want to check that out. But I just want to pause for a second. I want to go to the phones right now because Brian is on the line from Petaluma, California. Hi, Brian. What are your thoughts on this?
Hey, so I work in liturgical music. I've done music directing at churches and at other places for about 10 years. So,
wow.
Not a full career like other people, but I've definitely learned a lot in that time. And a couple of things that I thought worthy of talk were, first off, that, everyone comes at it from different backgrounds, and so everyone has a particular type of music that speaks to them. So there's a large number of people who would argue that music is very subjective. It speaks to you based on the culture you grew up in and what music, had an effect on you in the past, and so it's very personal. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is there's a certain type of music that is distinctly religious, or at least what's the word I'm looking for? Sacred,
Yep.
as in, like, you don't hear that type of music in the popular world.
Right.
You don't hear it on the radio too much. And so that has a kind of a special quality to bring to mind things of the spiritual kind of dimension, or at least get people to think beyond this world, and has, yeah.
I'm with you.
So
I
think there's a lot, right. The church has published a lot of documents throughout the ages. I think it was the late 18th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. Pope Pius X had documents that's talked a lot about in church circles about qualities of sacred music, things that make good music, and part of it is that it is good music. It's not contrived. Part of it is that it is sacred in form. It's not like, a march or a polka or something like that.
Yeah, let me ask you about that, Brian, because I remember hearing about during my days outside of the Catholic Church when I was a Protestant minister, before I came back into the church. I remember hearing a lot about when Martin Luther kind of touched off the Protestant Revolution. One of the things he did was he took a lot of songs that people sang in the bars, in the pubs, and he turned them into hymns. He basically took the tune and just put Christian words to the tune. So, for example, the famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," was actually a song that people used to sing when they were having these rowdy parties, and he made it. So the concept there was, I think his mindset was, what makes a song Christian isn't the tune, it's the words, it's the message. But I think really what the church is teaching on this, and I don't know if you can back me up on this or not. It's a little bit more than that. It's also, as you say, the form of the music. Like, for example, Gregorian chant, right? Would you say that to be the case, Brian?
I would definitely agree with you. I think there's kind of a both and, or at least admits in terms of degrees. So Pope Gregory, he took all the chants that he knew about at the time and that people could bring him, chants from Israel, chants from Greece, chants from Africa, and he took the best of those and codified it, so that now we had a set of melodies. Since it's always the melody that's the harder thing to write, the words, it's a lot, you can find a lot of hymns, for example, that have the same melody but different sets of words.
Yeah.
So there's a quality to it that kind of conjure these feelings of something greater than yourself, or something different, something otherworldly. Yeah. Now, I do have to add that I don't think that that's the only way to do it. There is value in taking a popular song and putting religious words to it, one that is easy to learn, easy to remember. But I think they're for different purposes.
Those are interesting thoughts, Brian. I really appreciate this call. This is Brian calling from Petaluma, California. And Brian, I'm really sorry. We got it. We're up against it here. We got to take a little break here. But I really want to thank you for your thoughts. Lots to chew on there. Thank you very much for calling in and for listening. This is Brian out in California. You can call in too if you want to react to this. 888-914-9149. Definitely have some thoughts on what you just heard. We'll be right back after this short break.
This is the Cale Clarke Show, giving you the confidence you need to bring the faith into everyday life.
Hey, welcome back to the show. 888-914-9149 is the number to call. You're listening to the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio. And hey, look who's on the line. Somebody I've never talked to, but I know a frequent guest on the Drew Mariani program, Dr. Bob Tabali, is on the line. Hello, Dr. Bob. Nice to talk to you. We've never spoken.
Hey, Cale, Western New Yorker here from the Finger Lakes area. Big Bills fan. I really enjoy your rooting for them. And I want to just tell you have a great show, and I really enjoy listening to you.
Well, thank you. I know you're a good person because you're a Bills fan. So
your show's much better than Drew's show.
I hope he's not listening right now.
Yeah, don't tell him I said that.
Oh, that's very kind. Not true, but very kind.
So this evening, I just wanted to share with you that I've had hundreds of patients I've cared for with this COVID surge recently, and people don't think that healthcare providers are affected by the demise of their patients. There have been some friends of mine who I cared for that didn't survive, and then you kind of feel that you let people down in some way. You weren't a perfect vessel of whatever. So anyway,
it's a lot to carry.
One of the things that I've used in order to help me get through this is I listen over and over again to Mozart's Requiem in D. Just a beautiful and there's this very nice Polish orchestra that does it. And then another thing that I'm to that I swear some of the music is right from heaven. I don't know if you know Hauser, the cellist.
Oh yeah, I love Hauser.
Yeah. So Hauser live from Zagreb. It's a free YouTube, and it's a full-length concert. And he does at the beginning he does all religious music. He does this piece that I think is one of the most beautiful things ever, the Benedictus from the Armed Man. The Armed Man was a mass that was written by a composer to celebrate British soldiers returning from World War I. And it's just stunning. And, he's got Pontus Angelicus and Ave Maria in there, just beautiful. But those are the things I just listen to over and over. I swear some of that music just comes straight from heaven. It really touches me in a deep way. But I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you did that. And, it speaks to your heart. And I agree with you. I think a lot of this stuff is, if it's not inspired by the Holy Spirit, because some of the stuff is just so sublime. It's just so sublime. And Dr. Bob, hey, listen, I really appreciate your kind words. And thanks for listening and calling in. I really was pleased to see your name up there and glad to make the connection.
Okay. Well, God bless you, and you got a wonderful show. I keep up the high standards because I like listening. So, thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Please pray for me. I appreciate the encouragement. Hey, go Bills, right? So that was Dr. Bob Tabali, and listen, have a great weekend, Dr. Bob. And is the other caller still on the line, Lucas? Or okay. We just had somebody hang up who had an interesting comment, but yeah, just this concept about how we can use music to connect with the divine. And this Grammy-winning artist Brad Mehldau, I was reading an essay that he wrote about this, and he unfortunately hasn't quite arrived at the conclusion that the Catholic faith is the true religion. He says he's vaguely Gnostic. And we talked a little bit about Gnosticism just a few minutes ago. But he talked about how in music you can connect with God. Also, you can imagine a great athlete connecting with God and during peak performance moments. Even a mathematician or a gardener, he says, the opportunity for a sublime experience is everywhere if we're open to it. And one of the things that he says is, as a Gnostic, the idea that God is far away makes sense to me. God would never talk to us in such close proximity, like the male figure of Western religions trying to spook us. A God doesn't need to do that. I think he's also misguided about this. This idea that God is trying to make us afraid. He hasn't grasped, I think, the true nature of who God is, because God is love. And one of the things that St. John the Apostle says in one of his letters, he's really known as the Apostle of Love. He used to be one of the sons of thunder, right? He and his brother Boanerges. And they're like, hey, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy this village because they won't listen to us? No, guys, you're on the wrong track here. Well, that was early in his career, but obviously as an older man, he wrote these beautiful letters in the New Testament. And one of the things that he said was that not only is God love, but he says perfect love casts out all fear. So I don't think God wants us to be afraid of him in that sense. And then this guy, and this is the whole point of the incarnation. Again, God becomes a baby. God is not far away. God came near. He became one of us. This is the approachability, just the infant in the manger draws you in. And this is what God wants. And so this guy, Brad Mehldau, goes on to talk about in his essay, God is an imposter. God cannot hear us. He's moved away from us. He's too far to reach. He's like in The Wizard of Oz. When near the end of the film, Dorothy and her friends discover the huge, frightening wizard is nothing more than an apparition. There's a small, sorry if I'm spoiling the movie, by the way, a small little guy, a frail man behind the curtain, and that's what he thinks God is all about. That he's all about fear and manipulation. Absolutely not. He comes to die for us. He doesn't want us to wallow in a fear of death. He wants us to be able to understand that we can conquer death. And Dr. Bob talked about the tragedy of watching his patients die. The hope of the resurrection is what gets us through. And that's what we're going towards here in Lent, this Lenten journey. We're coming towards Easter, the resurrection, the hope. And we know we live in that certain hope. That's why every Sunday, even in Lent, it's a resurrection day. We focus on that in the midst of our penances. And so I hope you have a very blessed weekend as we're leading up to the first Sunday in Lent. Thanks for joining me this week on the Cale Clarke Show. Can't wait to be with you next week. Lucas Holt produced, as always. Patrick Aylock took your phone calls. It's been a great week. God bless you. Please pray for me, and I'll pray for you. Tim Ree's up next, followed by Father Rocky and the Family Rosary. Take it away, Michaela.
Thank you for listening to my daddy.